There is a signature hiding inside ordinary names. Not a metaphor. A molecule. For centuries, a surname was treated as a story you inherited, a label passed from father to son, useful for taxes, land, and lineage, but ultimately just a word. Then geneticists looked closer, and something strange began to surface. Certain family names, scattered across continents, carried inside them a genetic echo. A pattern. A signal running quietly through the Y chromosome, the piece of DNA that, like a surname itself, passes almost unchanged from father to son, generation after generation. And in a handful of cases, that signal pointed somewhere unexpected, not to peasant farmers or anonymous villagers, but to kings, warlords, and the founding fathers of medieval dynasties. This is the story of what happened when historians handed their oldest assumptions to biology, and biology answered back with names. For most of human history, a surname was assumed to be a cultural artifact, nothing more. Someone became Smith because they worked iron. Someone became Fitzgerald because they were the son of Gerald. Someone became De Vere because their family once held land near a river called the Vere. Genealogists traced these names through parish registers, tax rolls, and land grants, reconstructing family trees on paper, one fragile document at a time. It seemed like a solid method. Names were legal. Names were recorded. Names surely did not lie. But paper only remembers what someone chose to write down. And biology remembers something paper cannot. Who was actually, biologically, the father? The first cracks appeared quietly, almost as a side effect of unrelated research. When scientists began sequencing Y chromosome DNA to study migration and ancient population movement, they noticed something almost by accident. Men who shared the same surname, especially rare or geographically clustered surnames, often shared strikingly similar Y chromosome markers, even when they had never met, even when their paper genealogies diverged centuries ago and left no trace of a common ancestor. That should not have been possible if surnames were just labels. It was possible only if, for a surprising number of family lines, the name and the biology had actually traveled together, father to son, for far longer than anyone expected. Something did not fit the old model. A cultural label was behaving like a biological one. This is where the science had to be explained carefully, because the tool itself is unusual. Most of the human genome shuffles every generation. Mother and father each contributing half, recombining into something new. But the Y chromosome does not shuffle. It passes from father to son almost intact, altered only by the slow, steady tick of random mutation. That makes it a molecular clock and a molecular fingerprint at the same time. Two men who share a distinctive set of Y chromosome markers are, statistically, very likely to share a father somewhere back in time, sometimes recently, sometimes 6, 8, or 10 centuries ago. In cultures where surnames pass patrilineally, the same way the Y chromosome does, researchers realized they had accidentally built a second historical record. One written in ink. One written in inheritance itself. And when they compared the two records against each other, the story did not simply confirm the family trees people already had. It complicated them. In some family lines, the DNA matched the documented genealogy almost perfectly, tracing an unbroken thread back to a name recorded in medieval charters. In others, the DNA revealed something the paperwork had quietly hidden, a break in the line, an unrecorded adoption, an inherited name that did not match the inherited chromosome at all. Historians call these events non-paternity events, a clinical term for a very human reality. At some point, a child carried a father's name without carrying his blood. That was not a scandal. It was a signal. It told researchers that surnames were not simple biological tracers, except in the cases where they were. And figuring out which surnames actually preserved a genuine, unbroken male lineage back to a single medieval founder became one of the most compelling puzzles in modern genetic genealogy. If you enjoy this kind of science-driven history, where old assumptions get quietly rewritten by evidence, stick with me, because some of what researchers found next reaches all the way into the deep courts of medieval Europe and Asia. 3 explanations emerged for why a surname might carry a strong, consistent genetic signature across hundreds of years, and each one tells a different kind of story. The first is founder effect. A single powerful or fertile man, often a noble with legal privilege, multiple wives, land, and generations of protected male heirs, becomes the biological source for an outsized share of descendants carrying his name. His genetic marker does not just persist. It multiplies. The second is clan structure. In regions where kinship groups controlled territory and defended a shared name fiercely, whole communities of men could descend patrilineally from one distant ancestor, with the surname acting almost like a genetic seal, reinforced by social pressure to marry within and remain loyal to the name. The third is what researchers sometimes call surname fidelity, a cultural discipline strong enough, over centuries, to keep the biological line and the name moving together almost without deviation, resisting the small breaks and substitutions that erode most family lines over time. Which explanation applied depended entirely on the name, the region, and the century. And that is where the landmark cases begin. One of the most cited examples in this field involves men bearing surnames historically associated with the O'Donnell, O'Neill, and related Irish dynastic names. Researchers studying Y chromosome markers across Ireland and among Irish diaspora populations found an unusually high concentration of one particular genetic signature among men carrying these surnames, a signature whose estimated age, based on mutation rate calculations, pointed back roughly 1.5 millennia, remarkably close to the era attributed to a semi-legendary High King remembered in Irish tradition as Niall of the Nine Hostages. The finding did not prove, with certainty, that every one of these men descended from a single historical king. Genetics cannot read royal titles. But it strongly suggested that an extraordinarily successful medieval patriline, one man, one Y chromosome, had propagated through conquest, political marriage, and dynastic expansion until it became embedded in millions of descendants, still traceable through their surnames today. A similar pattern emerged in the Scottish Highlands, among clans linked to the surname MacDonald and its variants. Researchers comparing Y chromosome data across clan branches found a shared genetic marker consistent with descent from a single medieval warlord remembered in tradition as Somerled, a 12th century ruler whose sons founded rival branches of what became Clan Donald. The paper Genealogy said these branches split centuries ago. The DNA said the split was real, but the shared root beneath it was too. And then there is the case that reaches furthest of all, out beyond Europe entirely, into the Eurasian steppe. Researchers analyzing Y chromosome data across a vast swath of Central Asia identified a single genetic lineage carried by an extraordinary number of men, spanning multiple modern ethnic groups, countries, and, crucially, surnames tied to claims of descent from Mongol nobility. The estimated age and geographic center of that lineage aligned with the era and empire of a single historical figure whose dynastic expansion was, by any measure, unmatched in scale, Genghis Khan. Here, the science had to be almost defiantly cautious. No laboratory has Genghis Khan's DNA to compare directly. What researchers found was a statistical signature, a common ancestor, positioned in time and place exactly where the historical empire was, carried today by tens of millions of men, many bearing surnames and clan names that trace, through oral and written tradition, back to Mongol nobility. This does not prove a single named individual, but it complicates, permanently, the idea that a surname is only a label. In some lines, a surname is a fossil, a living one. The twist is not simply that certain names carry noble blood. The twist is where the evidence stops matching the story people expected. Some surnames long assumed to be humble, occupational, and common, carried by farmers, laborers, tenants for generations, turned out, in isolated branches, to share a Y chromosome signature identical to lines documented among landed medieval families. Somewhere in the past, an unrecorded son of the nobility, born outside marriage or displaced by inheritance politics, carried the name downward into the world of ordinary people, and it stayed there, hidden in plain sight, for 600 years. Not the aristocratic surname everyone assumed carried the aristocratic blood. Sometimes it was the plain one. And the reverse happened too. Names that sounded regal, borrowed by families centuries ago for prestige, or granted by monarchs to loyal but genetically unrelated allies, showed no shared ancestral signature at all. The name was real. The nobility was real. The blood, in the strict genetic sense, was not what the name implied. The genome was not simply confirming aristocracy. It was revealing that aristocracy itself, as a bloodline concept, was always messier than the family trees pretended. This matters beyond genealogy hobbyists and royal enthusiasts because it reshapes something bigger, the assumption that lineage is linear, clean, and single-threaded. Human ancestry, even among the most carefully documented families in history, was never a straight line. It was a river with tributaries, diversions, floods, and quiet redirections that no official record captured. Kings had unacknowledged sons. Widows remarried into new names. Wards took the surname of a protector, not a father. Adoption, infidelity, political convenience, and simple survival all left invisible fingerprints, and only the Y chromosome, patient and largely unaltered, still carries the trace. Picture, for a moment, a stone keep on a windswept hill somewhere in the Scottish Highlands, mist moving low across the heather, a name carved above a doorway that has outlasted every person who ever spoke it aloud. Somewhere beneath that stone, in soil that has absorbed 9 centuries of rain, lie the remains of men who never knew their descendants would one day be traced not through parchment, but through a molecule too small to see, waiting patiently inside their bones and their blood for someone, eventually, to ask the right question. Now picture a different landscape entirely, the open grass sea of the Mongolian steppe, where the wind moves for hundreds of miles without a single obstruction, and somewhere beneath that same wind, an empire that once stretched from the Pacific to the edge of Europe left behind not just borders and conquest, but chromosomes, quietly multiplying through generations who never touched a sword or sat on a throne, yet carry, without knowing it, a genetic memory of one of history's most consequential men. If stories like this fascinate you, where a name on a page and a molecule in the blood tell 2 different versions of the same history, subscribe, because there is far more hidden inside ordinary inheritance than most of us ever imagined. What DNA has revealed about surnames and medieval nobility is not a tidy confirmation of old family pride. It is something stranger and more honest. It shows that power, once it enters a bloodline, does not stay contained. It spreads, dilutes, resurfaces, and sometimes hides inside names history assumed were unremarkable. It shows that the aristocratic families who guarded their genealogies most carefully were not always the ones whose blood matched the story, and that ordinary families, unaware and unclaimed, were sometimes carrying kings. The old idea was simple: a name tells you who you came from. The truth, written now in Y chromosome markers scattered across continents, is more layered. A name tells you who wrote the record. The chromosome tells you who actually walked the line before you, father to son, war to peace, century after century, whether history was watching or not. The map of noble descent was never as clean as the family trees suggested. It was always wider, older, and stranger than the names alone could say, and in more households than anyone expected, that older, stranger history is still quietly, biologically, alive.